This is CNN.
Entering its second week now, the jurors arrived at the courthouse just a few moments ago. As Chris Lawrence tells us, how long it takes these jurors to reach a verdict is anyone's guess.
If Michael Jackson's fans had their way, jurors would have needed 6 minutes to deliberate, not the 6 days it's taken so far. But the jury has to consider what 141 witnesses said and try to come to a unanimous decision on all 10 counts. Sources tell CNN they passed several questions to the judge on Friday and asked to have portions of the teenage accuser's testimony read back to them. The attorneys also had 3 meetings with the judge.
It could mean anything. 9 days to acquit Robert Blake, so many hours to convict someone else.
Prosecutors accused Jackson of sexually molesting a 13-year-old cancer survivor, giving the boy alcohol, and conspiring to keep him and his family captive. Jackson denied the charges and pleaded not guilty. In deciding who they believe, jurors have had about 28 hours of deliberation so far.
If they took 2 weeks, if they took 3 days, I would trust in it because they're the ones that have been sitting in there every day.
The first full week is over, the second about to begin.
And those jurors are being guided by nearly 100 pages of jury instructions. It's a lot of very detailed legal jargon, but the judge wanted to cover all his bases to lessen the chances of any appeal. Chris Lawrence, CNN, Santa Maria.
Well, how in the world is your
7th day? And as Chris Lawrence reports, how long it takes them to reach a verdict is anybody's guess.
If Michael Jackson's fans had their way, jurors would have needed 6 minutes to deliberate, not the 6 days it's taken so far. But the jury has to consider what 141 witnesses said and try to come to a unanimous decision on all 10 counts. Sources tell CNN they passed several questions to the judge on Friday and asked to have portions of the teenage accuser's testimony read back to them. The attorneys also had 3 meetings with the judge.
It could mean anything. 9 days to acquit Robert Blake, so many hours to convict someone else.
Prosecutors accused Jackson of sexually molesting a 13-year-old cancer survivor, giving the boy alcohol, and conspiring to keep him and his family captive. Jackson denied the charges and pleaded not guilty. In deciding who they believe, jurors have had about 28 hours of deliberation so far.
If they took 2 weeks, if they took 3 days, I would trust in it because they're the ones that have been sitting in there every day.
And those jurors are being guided by nearly 100 pages of jury instructions. It's a lot of very detailed legal jargon, but the judge wanted to cover all his bases to lessen the chances of any appeal. Chris Lawrence, CNN, Santa Maria.
Well, business
in his molestation trial reconvenes for a 7th day. We'll have a live report. Trial. Sources close to the case told CNN that jurors have asked to have testimony read back to them on Monday. Joining us now from Santa Maria, California with the latest is Rusty Dornan.
Well, Robin, there's been sort of a flat brewing over the last few days about this whole thing about readbacks in the jury because the court was not informing anyone about these questions or readbacks. There was a memo filed with the judge today saying, look, this is intolerable and unconstitutional that the final stage of this trial is cloaked in secrecy. And what would appear to be a response to that, we just received a statement from the court saying that were readbacks and certain questions asked at different periods of time. Apparently, we will be receiving those. Meantime, the jury's been deliberating more than 31 hours, and sources close to the case tell us that those readbacks, starting last Friday, involved the accuser's testimony. That stretched into this morning, that the jurors wanted to hear more about the testimony of Michael Jackson's accuser. Now, meantime, outside the courtroom, You've got 2,000 credentialed media plus all the fans and various other people who have shown up outside the courtroom. The natives were definitely restless this morning. There were a few altercations. The police had to step in a couple times and break people up because they were becoming angry. Some of the people who are here for religious reasons would get angry at some of the Michael Jackson fans, and that would cause a lot of yelling and pushing and that sort of thing. Also, outside Neverland Ranch, there has also been a visual of fans who are waiting to possibly see the superstar, we only presume that he is there at Neverland Ranch. He has 1 hour to come here to the courthouse when he is notified, and Neverland Ranch is about 40 minutes from Santa Maria. So far, Robin, everyone here is just watching and waiting. Now we will be told when the jury does have certain questions and that sort of thing, although it doesn't look like the court's going to be forthcoming about the content of those readbacks. And again, we'll have to be getting that from sources close to the case. Robin?
Great, thanks. That's Rusty Dornan from California with the latest. Now, within the Michael Jackson child molestation case, word coming to us from the courtroom in Santa Maria, California, that the jury, which has been deliberating this case now since Friday week last, has reached a verdict in the Michael Jackson child molestation case. Now, Michael Jackson has 1 hour from the announcement that a verdict has been reached to get to the courtroom, and so he presumably will be preparing to leave his Neverland Ranch now. We're expecting that the verdict will be read in an hour's time. It is now just after 8:37 here in London time. That is just after 12:37 midday in California. Michael Jackson presumably making preparations to leave the Neverland Ranch to go to the California courtroom, the courtroom being, of course, in Santa Maria, to hear the awaited verdict in his trial on child molestation charges. Now let's join our sister network, CNN USA, to bring us up to date. Ted Rowlands outside the courtroom speaking now.
The accuser's transcript read back in part on Friday, and then there was more readbacks again today. They had a question of the judge today. Clearly they were making their decision, and one could maybe assume that over the weekend some of these jurors came to grips with which way they were going to be going.
Ted, for those of us who haven't watched it as closely as you have, does this end up a he said sort of case, or was there direct evidence? What kind of case was presented by the prosecution?
Oh, clearly it's a he said, and which is common in a molestation trial. What is very stark are the differences. The differences here are two separate stories. Now I'm being told that the verdict will be read at 1:30 Pacific time. That is what the court has indicated, that at 1:30 Pacific time this verdict will be read. This case is unique because the prosecution has alleged that Michael Jackson is a monster, a child molester that used Neverland Ranch to lure his prey in, and then he developed his prey, if you will, and then abused them. They used accusations from back in 93 and 94 and talked about Michael Jackson and presented potential evidence of Michael Jackson fitting that characterization. On the other side, Thomas Mesereau, the defense lawyer, presented a Michael Jackson as a victim, saying that this family, this accuser, this young boy, was trying to shake down this international superstar, and they used examples of this family's history. They really did, on the defense case, put this family on trial. This family was involved in another lawsuit against J.C. Penney years ago, where the defense alleged they lied in similar fashion. So it's up to this jury, and this jury has mulled this over now. Which of these two drastically different stories do you believe? There's not a lot of wiggle room here at all for this jury. Either you believe this young lad or you don't, and you think that Michael Jackson is either guilty or a victim himself.
Ted, it's been a little while since I've covered a court case, but I do remember that in the days between the end of the trial and the verdict, there was always a lot of quarterbacking in the hallways by other lawyers, sometimes by the lawyers themselves. Was there a sense of who did better in this, was it the prosecution, the prosecuting of this case, or the defense?
Well, I tell you that, there's 2,000 plus members of the media covering this. Everything that was said in court has been analyzed ad nauseum. And I would say that most people believe that the prosecution and the defense put on wonderful cases using the evidence available. There's not a lot of evidence in a child molestation case. It's the child's word against the adult's word. That said, the level of prosecution and the level that Thomas Mesereau had on the defense side was incredible, and it really did make for the 3 months to go a little bit quicker for courtroom watchers and those of us in the courtroom. And I think that by and large people agree that this is a tough one. People walked out scratching their head. It could go either way. Usually you have a sense, usually you think, oh, I bet he'll be guilty, or I'll bet he's not guilty, and it's a surprise verdict. Either way, I think this could go not guilty or guilty on any one of these 10 counts.
Ted, we want to remind our viewers of what you have just said, which is that we expect to hear what the verdict is. 1:30 your time out on the West Coast. That's 4:30, obviously, on the East Coast. Let me move you along and ask you about what is Michael Jackson facing here? What are the punishment in terms of these counts that he is up against?
Well, he has the first count. We'll just go 1 through 10. The first count is a conspiracy charge, and the allegation here is that he and some co-conspirators tried to keep this family at bay after the Martin Bashir documentary was played, and the reason was because they were considered a public relations nightmare. A difficult charge to prove in this case because there was not a lot of evidence. And the conventional wisdom by the people covering the trial and attorneys that are covering it is that this is the toughest one for the prosecution, and it may go Jackson's way more so than the other ones. Then you get into 4 counts of molestation. 2 of them were from the witness himself, the alleged victim himself. The accuser got up and detailed 2 separate molestation acts at the hands of Michael Jackson. The other 2 are eyewitness accounts from the accuser's brother, his younger brother, who had some problems on the stand in terms of contradicting himself, and whether or not this jury believes, especially the brother, will be very interesting to see. Then you have 4 alcohol charges, which allege that Michael Jackson used alcohol to furtherance his crime, to use alcohol to basically ply these young boys, or this one alleged victim, into a state of intoxication so that his job would be easier, if you will, to molest him. That is what is alleged here. Jurors have the option on the alcohol charges to say, we don't think it was used in a molestation scenario, but we think he gave him alcohol, and that would be a misdemeanor. So if they don't believe that Jackson is guilty of the molestation, they could still find him guilty of the alcohol. There is one other molestation charge on the table, and that is an attempted molestation, and that was alleged by the accuser as well. There's a gamut in terms of which way this jury can go. They could come through with a split verdict, guilty on some charges and not on others. The bottom line for Michael Jackson, if he's found guilty of any of the sexual molestation charges, he will most likely be taken into custody immediately. His bail will be taken away, and will go to the Santa Barbara County Jail until sentencing. There's 20 days are allowed. A defendant has a right to 20 days before they are sentenced. Usually they waive that time. But he will not walk out of this courthouse when those black SUVs pull up here, presumably they do. It may be the last time for Michael Jackson to be a free man, depending on which way this jury goes.
Ted Rollins, who's been watching this for us throughout the trial. Ted, stand by a minute. We want to go on the phone now. We have our CNN legal analyst, Jeffrey Toobin, with us. Jeffrey, this has got to be the time when a defense attorney's stomach is churning.
Oh, everybody's stomach is churning, but especially the defendant. You know, there's an old line about defendant and his client, where defendant gets convicted and he says, "What do we do now?" And the lawyer says, "What do you mean we?" I mean, this is really Michael Jackson, whose life is potentially really in jeopardy. And you know, it is, the decision is made, and we just need to hear what it is.
You know, a lot has been made with talk about the circus that's been surrounding this trial, but from what you've been able to see inside the courtroom, has that circus atmosphere been largely absent? Has this been tried pretty much like any other case?
Well, I don't think a trial where Jay Leno and Chris Tucker testifies is like any other case, but I do think the circus charge has been somewhat overstated. Judge Melville, I think, has kept a tight rein on the proceedings. Many people thought this trial would last 6 months. It didn't. It lasted, less than 4 of courtroom time. So I think it was an orderly and fair trial. And outside, at the beginning of the trial, there were a lot of people, and right now in Santa Maria there are a lot of people. But during the trial, many days there were hardly any spectators at all. So I think you can get a somewhat of a misimpression of the circus if you only focus on the most extreme elements of that charge.
Let me ask you about he said trials. In the case where there is no direct evidence, is there a way that a jury tends to go? Has there been any sort of look at these kinds of trials where the jury is more sympathetic toward the victim or more sympathetic toward the defendant, or is it just impossible to categorize?
Well, the key factor in cases where there is essentially a swearing contest, people, one person's word against the other, is corroboration. Does one side, can they corroborate the story? And that's why the key part of this trial, I think, was the so-called 1108 evidence, the California provision of evidence, of law of evidence, which allowed the prosecution to bring in evidence of 4 other or 5 other boys who claimed they were molested. I think that was enormously important. And if Michael Jackson's convicted, that's going to be the reason he's convicted.
Okay.
Let me bring in another legal analyst we have here on the phone with us, Kendall Coffey. Kendall, when you look at this trial of 14 weeks of testimony and arguments, 7 days of jury deliberation, put me in the place of both the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney right about now. What are they doing?
Well, nervous as can be. I think the prosecution is probably cautiously optimistic that they're going to get some convictions on at least some of the major counts. I say that because while it was a 7-day deliberation, given the kind of case it is, the number of counts, the complexity of the conspiracy count, as well as the various jury instructions on that, I can see prosecutors feeling pretty good about the prospect that this is a jury that was very, very careful, but worked its way through the evidence, and apparently the recent readbacks that this jury was asking for were of the alleged victim himself. And at the end of the day, this case is not about Jay Leno, Chris Tucker, or even the accused victim's mom. It's about the believability of the alleged victim. If they believe the accuser, they are to convict the alleged abuser, and that may be what the prosecution is thinking right now.
Let me put the same question to you that I asked Jeffrey Toobin a minute ago, and that is, in cases where there is two swearing different things, do juries tend to feel more empathetic toward a victim? Does that hold sway in the deliberations?
I think victims have an edge because you get right down to it. There's not necessarily an obvious reason for them to lie. There is always a reason for defendants to deny. A little different here because the defense did a very skillful job of portraying the alleged accuser, in particular the mom and the family, as basically scrambling and scheming with a massive con trying to hit the jackpot for millions of dollars. But when it's all said and done, I think that right now the Jackson camp's got to be even more nervous than the prosecution. Again, I think it's going to come down to the alleged victim. And he seemed to be in sort of the close of this trial, somebody that the jury was starting to believe.
So at this point, if I were to ask you who you thought tried the better case, sounds to me like you think the prosecution did a better job of laying out its case.
I think the defense did an incredible job in terms of everything they were dealing with, and I think the prosecution made a lot of mistakes along the way. But so many times it comes to a strong close, and I thought the prosecution's closing, both in terms of the oral argument to the jury and some of the things they focused on right at the very end, were extremely, extremely effective. And the one thing the defense didn't do is really explain Michael Jackson and Neverland. He seems incredibly strange, incredibly weird, and the prosecution had an explanation for that he's a Pied Piper leading young boys into a predator's lair. What the defense didn't really do, perhaps as much as they could have, would have, should have done, is explain why this was an innocent Peter Pan portraying childhood fantasies. I don't think the jury necessarily got comfortable with Michael Jackson, and it becomes much easier, if that's the case, to believe the prosecution's explanation for this very, very unusual person and this bizarre setup at Neverland.
It's pretty obvious that if there is a finding of not guilty, that Michael Jackson walks free, and that's the end of that. Walk me through what legal remedies are still open to a defendant should there be any kind of guilty verdict on any of these 10 counts.
Well, the first issue is going to be whether he's immediately remanded. That means straight to jail as opposed to being at liberty while the judge deals with sentencing, and even while perhaps the Jackson defense team pursues an appeal. That's a very large issue, and I think the judge is going to listen closely to the prosecution's position on that. If they very heavily insist that Jackson be immediately remanded, making the argument that that's normally what is done with convicted child molesters. And by the way, Jackson is an international figure with international access, and Roman Polanski, as we all recall, another alleged child abuser, has been in Paris these many years. So I think if the prosecution makes a strong enough push, that Jackson could very well be remanded if convicted of some of the serious charges. And beyond that, there's going to be motions for new trial. If the defense loses, there's certainly going to be huge issues at sentencing. The way California law works, that if Jackson were convicted of multiple charges, again, nobody has any idea what this jury is going to do at this point. But if he were convicted of multiple charges, the judge has a lot to say about whether particular sentences run consecutively, which means more time is added on for each sentence, or whether they're run concurrently, which means that during the same period he is effectively serving one sentence, he would simultaneously be serving other sentences. Obviously, a huge difference in terms of the ultimate amount of prison exposure, and something which the judge has a lot of discretion to decide.
We want to remind our viewers, first of all, you've been partaking of the wisdom of Kendall Coffey, a former U.S. attorney, a legal analyst. Kendall, let me ask you to stand by just a second, because I want to go to CNN's Brooke Anderson, who is standing outside Neverland. We do know that Michael Jackson was given an hour after the time that the jury announced it had a verdict to go from wherever he was to the courthouse. Let me ask you, Brooke, is there any sign that Michael Jackson is indeed at Neverland?
Candy, that's a great question, and we have been monitoring the gate here at Neverland, the front gate. We have seen no comings and goings of his motorcade this morning. We have been told all along that Jackson is waiting here for the verdict with his friends and family, but we were told that by his former spokeswoman, Raymond Bain, and she was fired over the weekend. So it's been difficult to get information. It has been between 15-20 minutes since it was announced the verdict has come down. Like you said, the judge has given him 1 hour to get to the courthouse. The courthouse in Santa Maria, about 30 miles away. That's about a 30 to 40 minute drive. So we do expect if he is here, he does need to be leaving pretty soon. Candy, if he leaves, it could be a really long time if he ever comes back to Neverland. If he does come back to Neverland, if he's sentenced on any of the charges, the punishment could vary widely from probation to 18 years and 8 months in prison. The judge could remand him immediately into custody if he assumes he is a flight risk or a danger to the community. But again, we don't know if he is here for certain. And then if he is and he goes to the courthouse, if he's acquitted, he could be back later on this afternoon.
So what sort of activity have you seen throughout the day? I'm not even sure how long you've been out there, if you've been out there every day since the trial started. Has he been coming in and out over the past week while the jury's been deliberating?
I have been here since during the closing arguments, so a week and a half or so, and he has been back and forth, especially during the closing arguments. We would see when his convoy would arrive, he would roll down the window and wave to fans as he came in and out. But during jury deliberations, when the motorcade would leave and when it would come back, the windows were rolled up, very tinted. We could not see in the windows. Activity as far as fans, a handful of fans here now behind me. As the day progresses, as we've seen, more and more fans would come here after the jury would go home from deliberations. But I believe the activity with the fans is at the courthouse right now as they await for Jackson's arrival from wherever he is right now. It could be here, it could not be.
Brooke Anderson, who is standing outside Neverland, home of Michael Jackson. I'm sure you'll stand by since you've been there for a week and a half. I want to go back to the courthouse now, where we have CNN's Ted Rowlands. Ted, have you seen any of the principals coming into the courtroom? What's changed since last we talked?
Well, just a few minutes ago, I saw Mag Nicolas, an assistant district attorney, arrive in his vehicle. They had to part the waves of crowds to allow him to come in and get inside the courthouse. Presumably, Tom Sneddon, the district attorney here, is already inside along with the other attorneys because they have had some conferences. In fact, there was one today, this morning, with both sides. So only one new face, if you will, in the last few minutes. The crowd seems to be not at its highest level, but definitely at one of its highest frenzied levels, if you will. There's a lot of anticipation here and a sense of nervousness as well outside the courthouse to see what happens here. After waiting and waiting, the time is fast approaching where these Michael Jackson supporters will see whether or not their idol is going to be found guilty or not guilty. The media is penned up. The folks that will be going into the courtroom off to the right here, you won't be able to see it, but they will be going in the next few minutes, all trying to get a good seat so that they can document this and document the reaction of all of the players as the verdicts are read.
Ted, let me ask you about some of those people that we're seeing. Is this essentially the same crowd that comes every day? Who are these people?
There are a core group that, in fact, one individual left his home in Tennessee and has been here every day since Michael Jackson made his first court appearance. But the bulk of the folks are coming on vacation. They're coming from all over the world. People will spend a week here, maybe a few days here, maybe a few hours here. People are just sort of stopping by to get a glimpse of it. And then there are the hardcore base groups of Michael Jackson supporters, the locals that have been here with regularity, and then the folks that have come from around the world that do spend considerable time here and have made multiple trips. Clearly, 95% of the people outside this courthouse on any given day are pro-Michael Jackson supporters. They bring signs, they chant. They can't wait for him to get out of his black SUV. They go crazy, and he always turns and waves to them. One quick acknowledgement, and that seems to be enough for them. They're fenced off, they're barricaded off, and today there is a line of police officers that will be between them and the courthouse when this is read.
Ted, let me first remind our viewers that you have told us that we are expecting the verdict to be given roughly half an hour from now, 1:30 your time, 4:30 on the East Coast. So we are waiting for that in roughly half an hour. And let's recap again. Can you walk me through the 10 counts that are against Michael Jackson at this point?
Well, assuming the court is on schedule and they don't allow for any sort of delay, at 1:30 Pacific time, there will be an audio feed that we will be able to hear outside the courtroom and broadcast. The judge allowed for this audio feed. We'll hear the court clerk, Lorna Fry, detail each and every count. She'll go starting with count 1, which is conspiracy. She'll say, we, the members of the jury, find that Michael Joe Jackson is guilty or not guilty of conspiracy. And then she will go on. If he is found not guilty, that'll be it. If he is found guilty of conspiracy, she will then detail whether or not he is guilty of child abduction, false imprisonment, or extortion as an arm of that conspiracy charge. Next up will be count 2, and this really will tell us whether or not this jury believes the defense or if they believe this young man who has accused Michael Jackson of molestation. Counts 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all counts of lewd acts on a child. Two of the counts 2 and 3, are alleged by the accuser. Counts 3 and 4 are alleged by the accuser's brother. He says that he saw Michael Jackson with his hand touching his brother one late evening while his brother was sleeping. That accounts for 3 and 4. Count 5 is an attempted commitment of lewd act on a child. And then counts 6, 7, 8, and 9 have to do with alcohol. They are administering alcohol as an agent to further the lewd acts. Jurors have a choice with the alcohol charges. They can either find Michael Jackson not guilty on all counts, or they can find him not guilty of using alcohol to commit molestation, but guilty of providing alcohol to someone who is underage. That is a misdemeanor, and many people think that if this jury finds him not guilty across the board, they may find him guilty of providing alcohol to minors. The sentence there is a year in county jail. The prospect, or the chance that the judge would remand him to custody on just that would be very slim. He would most likely be able to go free on bail until he is sentenced. There's a wide range in terms of what this jury can do and what this judge can do when it comes time for sentencing.
Ted Rowlands, I know you will stand by for us. Kendall Coffey, legal analyst, also standing by. And of course, our Jeffrey Toobin, our CNN political analyst. And what we want to do is continue with CNN's live coverage. That verdict in about half an hour. Our coverage continues right now with Wolf Blitzer.
Thanks very much, Candy. About 30 minutes or so from now, give or take a few minutes, the verdict will be in. Michael Jackson, guilty or not guilty, the various options before this jury. They've been deliberating now for the past couple of weeks. Jeffrey Toobin is with us here in our Washington studio. You've been watching this trial very closely. Jeffrey, give our viewers a sense right now of the enormity of what is about to happen in the life of Michael Jackson.
Well, I mean, it's really simple, Wolf. You have one of the top, I would say, dozen most famous people in the world who perhaps a half hour from now may be in criminal custody, maybe go into prison. I mean, as Ted Rowlands has said earlier, for several of these crimes, if he is convicted, it is very likely that his bail will be revoked if he is convicted, and he will receive a sentence of many years in prison. So Michael Jackson's freedom is not only at stake in some abstract sense, but concretely, he may be in custody before the hour is out.
And so if he is convicted on some of the more serious charges, the felony charges against him, he could be sent to jail right away. He wouldn't necessarily be released on bail as the appeal process begins.
Absolutely not. He will not be released pending appeal. However, his lawyer will argue for him to be released pending an appeal, and I expect a lengthy and passionate argument by Tom Mesereau if Jackson is convicted for granting him bail. But based on the way California law usually operates, given the seriousness of this crime, he will almost certainly be put in custody right away.
Which would be a dramatic change in the lifestyle of this pop star. Clearly something that he is not necessarily going to be able to accept easily, given his lifestyle, given his mentality, given what he's gone through over these years.
And given his physical condition. One of the things that was striking to me, having seen him at the beginning of the trial and at the end of the trial, is how Michael Jackson has physically deteriorated over the course of this trial. Remember, last January was the time that he hopped up on top of that SUV and did a little dance for his fans. Now, whatever you think of that little incident, it took a physically fit man to do it. He is a shell of that man a year and a half later. He walks with difficulty. He seems medicated. His skin is a terrible gray pallor. The deterioration in Michael Jackson has been considerable, and if you think about the possibility of prison, that could accelerate.
Stand by for a moment, Jeff. Brooke Anderson's over at Neverland Ranch in California. We see some aerial shots of some cars. I assume, Brooke, he's getting ready to leave Neverland to head over to the courthouse in Santa Maria. Is that what we're seeing right now?
Hi there, Wolf. I believe you were asking me if we're getting ready to see Michael Jackson leaving Neverland, and indeed we are. We are looking at aerial pictures of Jackson's motorcade. We see the black SUVs, which we have seen so often coming in and out of this gate during the trial and in and out during deliberations this past week and a half. It has been more than 30 minutes. It has been more than 30 minutes since the judge let everyone know that a verdict has come down. It's about a 30-mile drive from here to the courthouse, so it's about a 30 to 40-minute drive. So he needs to leave pretty soon to make that deadline of 1 hour. We are waiting there. There aren't too many fans out here. A couple fans are here. A lot of photographers are here. Everyone just waiting for the gates to open and for that motorcade to exit and head to Santa Maria.
Well, I think it's clear to say that they're not going to read the verdict until he is inside that courthouse in Santa Maria. They're going to wait for him to show up. It's clearly that could take at least a half an hour, Jeffrey Toobin, for him to make that drive from Neverland to Santa Maria.
Well, I mean, I think this is an example of how Michael Jackson's life may be about to change. You know, throughout this whole trial, there's been a lot of waiting for Michael, and the trial starts when Michael arrives, and, you know, he's getting ready. And you know what? Once you're in custody, you don't have the luxury of people waiting around for you. You know, I mean, I know, I've been out there, I know the distances. There is no way he is going to get there by 4:30 Eastern time, but they will not read the verdict, as you point out, until he returns. So I think this is just an example of perhaps diva-like behavior that when you're in the custody of the California prison system is no longer an option.
I had heard, Jeffrey, that they were going to give the news media, the public, a 60 to 90-minute advance notification after the jury had reached the verdict. They would have 60 to 90 minutes to get everyone in place in order for the verdict to be read in front of the defendant, in this particular case, Michael Jackson. So he might make that 90-minute deadline, if in fact there is a 90-minute deadline.
He might make 90, but given the way the tension surrounding these sorts of events, things tend to slow down a little bit, and I would be surprised if they make the 90. And certainly they won't make the 60.
The 4:30 Eastern was the 60-minute deadline, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. on the West Coast, the 90-minute deadline. If, in fact, there is a 90-minute deadline, there's been some conflicting reports I've seen whether they would have 60 to 90 minutes to get going. The judge was irritated early on. I believe the first appearance by Michael Jackson when he showed up late. Presumably the judge would be irritated this time, but it's I don't know if it would be much of a deal at this late stage in the process.
Yeah. If Michael Jackson is convicted, the least of his problems is being a little late to court.
The whole nature. Let's review some of these charges against him. Count 1 is a felony violation of conspiracy involving 28 individual overt acts of child